The video starts with the beginning of the movie, and he's just like, bam, look at how cool it is, the sound, the visuals, it's so good. And then he goes on to praise how good the communication skills are in the movie, and how good they are at filling the screen with interesting things to look at 53 seconds, and he says,
despite being a blatant advertisement, the movie pulls an equally blatant fuck you to the studio and the corporatism thereof.
So I looked up their stuff and I found out they actually only have one stop motion team, the Lego team, and one animation studio, Animal Logic. Animal Logic is a well-known, fantastically talented team who aren't overly numerous and all typically love their jobs. They aren't robots in the name of the company. They're quite far from Lord Business's totalitarian monopoly, who, under his condition, has no need to follow any code of ethics or morals whatsoever. When Octan makes a movie, they do it alone. They do it with the money of the people who they control, and whatever they make is the only thing that people can watch. Animal Logic is a VFX company among thousands of CGI studios who could have been chosen to do this movie, and Animal Logic happens to have been chosen because they were seen as either particularly skilled, or because the price was right, or because the timeline was the best, or it could have just been a fortunate coincidence that there happened to be a connection leading to a mitigation of the necessity to search for any other studio. Or it could have been a combination of all of these things that was quite fortunate for them, the producers. Point being that the US president didn't send armed men to shut down the Lego movie when its profits weren't being promised to be sent to the great leader, because that's not how capitalism works. But I'm getting ahead of myself. I pointed out in the original recording, Lord Business has infinite robots doing the same menial calculations infinitely, whereas Animal Logic is a small studio of individuals who are all specialized in different things. And all those specialized in the same thing help each other or work in different projects to get more work done. They're all differently talented, giving the company a robust diversity, which is a natural phenomenon of capitalist ventures. Lord Business's Octan is a purified monopoly in a purified monotony. Only robots, all doing basic monotonous tasks. This is the hollow shell of a post-capitalist society that has been corrupted to its own demise through authoritarian intervention and totalitarian state idolatry, not a healthy, unimpeded, free market economy. Just after that, about a minute into the video, he said,
throughout the movie, corporations...
He pluralizes it incorrectly because there's only one corporation. Anyway, he says,
throughout the movie, corporations are treated like the unspeakably evil entities that they are.
He immediately moves on from this apparently self-evident fact. Now, why are corporations seen as evil? If we look at the living conditions before businesses were able to be founded by anybody and compete with anybody, there were a lot fewer people living in much worse conditions. After the Enlightenment and Industrial Revolution, the Western thinkers of Britain and America came to the conclusion that it was self-evident that all men were born equal and should be considered sovereign to their own rights. After this mentality shift from the feudal mentality of I was born into a particular class from which I will never escape except with fantastically amazing luck, all of these countries opened up free trade and the market to anybody who's willing to participate in it. What followed was immense prosperity, the likes of which had never been seen in all of recorded history. It was a Cambrian explosion of ideas, products, and services that brought to the common man things that kings couldn't have dreamed of, and brought to the beggar conditions that he never could have dreamed. In fact, many were pulled out of poverty despite the massive increase in population. The surplus population problem that existed in England, that exists in A Christmas Carol, disappeared when a free market economy was embraced and the poor policies were altered or abandoned. Marxism Unmasked from Delusion to Destruction by Ludwig von Mises. I'm going to read a couple paragraphs from this, because it's pretty pertinent in this video, I think. Quote, Marx assigned a special meaning to slavery, serfdom, and other systems of bondage. It was necessary, he said, for the workers to be free in order for the exploiter to exploit them. This idea came from the interpretation that he gave to the situation of the feudal lord who had to care for his workers even when they weren't working. Marx interpreted the liberal changes that developed as freeing the exploiter of the responsibility for the lives of the workers. Marx didn't see that the liberal movement was directed at the abolition of the inequality under law as between serf and lord. For Marx, the whole Industrial Revolution simply consisted of the exploitation of the workers by the capitalists. The difference between their situation and that of slaves and serfs was only that the capitalist had no obligation to care for workers who were no longer exploitable, while the lord was bound to care for slaves and serfs. Marxian writers do not explain why production proceeds from simpler to more and more complicated methods, nor did Marx mention the following fact. About 1700, the population of Great Britain was about 5.5 million. By the middle of 1700, the population was 6.5 million, about 500,000 of whom were simply destitute. The whole economic system had produced a surplus population. The old economic system in England couldn't cope with the surplus population. The existing system of guilds and other monopolies in the existing industries made the expansion of industry impossible. If capitalism had not provided the means of sustenance for these surplus people, they would have died from starvation. It is not true, as Marx said, that the improvements in technology are available only to the exploiters, and that the masses are living in a state much worse than on the eve of the Industrial Revolution. Everything the Marxists say about exploitation is absolutely wrong. Lies. In fact, capitalism made it possible for many persons to survive who wouldn't have otherwise. And today, many people, or most people, live at a much higher standard of living than at which their ancestors lived 100 or 200 years ago. Close quote. These so-called evil corporations don't exploit their workers, as is described by Marx. So then this interpretation of corpos being evil isn't a product of capitalism. It's coming as a byproduct of the interventions made by the governments to appeal to the very complaints that these socialist-leaning individuals had. The very thing that produced your discomfort with the system your country operates under is what you now defend and attack, misinterpreting it as capitalism. Moving on. So between 1:30 and 2 minutes-ish in, he talks about the beginning and end halves of the movie and what they hold, and praises them for their different things. Praises the intro scene for being brief. He doesn't really give any interpretation for what the scene means at all. To me, it looks like it was an analogy for the kid stealing the crazy glue so that dad couldn't keep gluing all of his set down, and then the dad comes and takes the glue back. And then there was an argument that would happen, and the kid was like, let me build how I want. I want to build, I don't want to just follow the instructions. And then the dad covered his head in a blanket and said, go to sleep or something. And then the prophecy there, as far as the analogy goes to real life, the analogy really doesn't do anything in that father-son thing. It's just a plot device. The plot device is sort of declaring the son's plot goals. So to make a political analogy out of that, though, we have a dictator demanding his rules be followed so that he can achieve the perfect system, to be cemented forever, to end history. There's a dissenter who suggests another way of living, or another way of existing, which is existentially problematic to the dictator, who removes the person's ability to see such fantasies through struggle sessions or disappearings. This is very Maoist, not at all a trait of capitalism. To analogize the prophecy, one day, the prophecy says, one day a talented lasso
fellow, a special one with face of yellow, will make the piece of resistance found from its hiding refuge underground. And with a noble army at the helm, this master builder will thwart the craggle and save the realm, and be the greatest, most interesting, most important person of all times. All this is true because it rhymes.
This special one, with a face of yellow, is referring to the fact that despite being unseen, there's a non-material force that drives this individual in a way that is unique to his peers. And by his talent, he will unlock the mode with which society can defeat the cementing of an ostensible utopia, from taking from them their liberty. That first line, one day a talented lasser fellow, is skipped in Maxmunich's video, probably because it blatantly contradicts his thesis. Then he says he feels
The Lego Movie takes a much more communitarian approach. I would classify it as a kind of Communist Manifesto.
says Emmett is a stereotypical working man, and Lord Business is a stereotypical evil corpo man. It says,
It tells us, in no uncertain terms, that we must band together as people if any good is to be done.
while this is true in an isolated top-down totalitarian state, it's irrelevant under a healthy, functioning free market. It's intrinsic to a free market economy that the common man is the one with the voting power on which the economy does well. This makes it inherent to corporations to be welded to the demands of the public, serving their interests first. He essentially says the movie acts as a communist manifesto because of its boiling down of Emmett and Lord Business to being the quintessential proletarian and bourgeois. He uses this to say Emmett foments revolutionary fervor using his class consciousness to bring a new state of being to the world by the confiscation and redistribution of the means of production. And he says,
This is not to say that the movie thinks problems will cease to exist once our society is more equal. Rather, collective ownership is the only way a society can be organized morally.
collective ownership, however, is impossible to achieve. Yet funnily enough, it is the exact solution that all socialists hold. However, it's fundamentally flawed because they'll have no method of calculating which method is best to be employed, and when, and where, and using what resources, and by whom, and how much, and the manpower necessary, and so on down the supply chain. The result? Well, we can look at the most thriving socialist economy ever to exist, modern China. Wherever you go there, you ask for a food, you ask for a product, you're very often going to hear the word mayo. I don't know how to pronounce it, but that's the word. You'll hear it a lot. It means don't have. Most items on the menu are unavailable all the time. It's not a population issue, as we can see evident with the surplus population in industrial Britain going away through the free trade. So it has nothing to do with the population. The population growth isn't an issue, or it wouldn't be if you had the right system. This is an issue of economic calculation in a socialist state. It's one of fabrications which are updated by trial and error. The most intelligent socialists who admit the issues of economic calculation under socialism take the stance that the best solution is a trial and error method, where after generations of trial and error trying to find the correct price, eventually, in the end, the price will stay the same forever. When communism is achieved, the prices will never change again, and everything will be perfectly self-perpetuating. The road to achieve this is full of famine, drought, Lysenkoist agriculture and medicine, and more deaths and oppression than you can possibly imagine. Just the line, the only way a society can be organized morally then? Complete and total lie. It's also relevant, I think, to compare charity in China to America, or the pollution of big business in China compared to America, or its tolerance to free thought. All of these problems come from interventions from the totalitarian communist state, and they wouldn't exist under an unhampered free market economy. Under the false economy, the false utopia, society is based on lies. The philosophies building the philosophies were flawed themselves, but their combination was so contradictory in itself, the introduction of their combination was a lie. So the communist society is one that is not just based on lies, but it's based on lies which were based on lies, which then propagate lies, and then propagate the propagation of lies. This is a system, he claims, is the only one capable of achieving moral organization, and yet the outcome is so utterly unmoral, many would use it as a basis for the definition of evil. For example, look at charity. In socialist states, it doesn't exist, because it can't. The state is responsible for redistributions. So if you choose to redistribute something according to your own calculation of needs, then you've just made a slight against the state. If you found somebody who is in need of charity, that person has exactly what the state means for them to have. Perhaps they deserve to have less bread because of a thought crime committed by their parents, and for this they must struggle for the betterment of those who are potentially oppressed. If you give charity, you just questioned the utopic state of socialism and declared your distrust with the party's judgments. This is punishable by depersoning you, and until you've been re-educated, you can't rejoin society. In the meantime, as a non-person, you get no social credit and are treated as a barbaric enemy of all humanity. This is not an exaggeration, in fact, this is putting it lightly. I've gone over how corporations are inherently operating in the interest of the masses, or at least their target audience. But I want to suggest here that leads to moral company policies being the best corporate strategy. Undercutting and exploiting the consumer, unless there are interventions making it the only choice for a consumer, will lead consumers elsewhere and lead to the dissolution or changing of that company. There's no better option than to be oppressed. That's never a side effect of a free market economy. It's a side effect of government or cartel manipulation or intervention. But yeah, go ahead, lie to yourself and tell yourself that it's the only moral way of organizing. Anyway, then he asked,
I understand that for some people, this movie being an advert kind of guts it of a socialist message. If that's you, I would invite you to consider otherwise. Is the message of this movie that we need to build our own businesses, that we should compete, that other people are just NPCs in your story? No.
Again, a completely deluded line of thought. I think yes, in fact, the moral kind of is to start your own business and compete. Emmett competed with Lord Business and won in the free market of ideas. He was able to produce his double-decker couch and only calculate if people want it or not by the performance of its sales. They doesn't actually show that happening, but would be true. And you would get calculation of whether or not people want it or whether or not it satisfies a need based on the performance of its sales, not just asking people around you or noticing that they're, in the case of communist distribution model, you'll notice that these couches are being discarded on the street and used for fuel or being torn down for scrap parts. So yes, this is the moral. Start your own business and compete. Otherwise, if you just go with what everyone else is doing, you get $37 coffee in a company which everyone works for, who makes everything and owns the entire world. The moral is that everyone must share their ideas and compete their ideas against each other to get the best possible outcome for all. This means everyone using a finite number number of bricks that came in the box, to make all sorts of conflicting ideas which demand the same resources, meaning the moral of the story has competition over scarcity. The moral is also to look at each other not as NPCs, but as brilliant individual minds with their own unique talents to bring to the table, and to see whose ideas hold the most water, and whose make a society as a whole more satisfied with their purchase. Better products means an easier life by releasing life's grip, demanding that you work for someone else, letting you work on and for yourself. Which in most cases in a capitalist society is in searching for something that enriches others. Maxmunich then says,
No, the film is straight up telling you that capitalism is evil.
Meanwhile, there's a globe-controlling company that dictates the execution of all things through instructions, and the state of things through rules, which is completely antithetical to capitalism. Then he says
that the world is for everyone, and we must work together to build a better one.
And I absolutely agree. The way to determine which person should have access to which resources should come from his particular ability to accomplish that task. We need to accomplish this assessment. The only method discovered in human history of accomplishing that assessment is using a medium of exchange, namely money. In order for all these things to be accomplished, we have to agree that particular people have sole usage rights over the means and goods necessary for production. This means property rights are intrinsic to calculating who is more capable of accomplishing societally beneficial tasks, making a free market economy necessarily a universally community-positive social structure when there is no authoritarian intervention in place, especially by use of aggressive force. Then he compares the Socratic paradox, I know that I know nothing, to
I know that I am not special.
Very Marxian comparison because it's dialectically synthesizing a truth to a lie. Well, it's Hegelian anyway. The lie being that he knew nothing because he was unaware of his class structure before touching the piece of resistance. It's an awakening of his class consciousness. He now knows that he knew nothing and nobody in their particular state is special because they operate as per their class interests subconsciously. The lie is that this is a fact that exists under capitalism. The lie is that this I know that I am not special thing applies to you now, because Marx's interpretation of the class structure was based on the class structure of feudalism, which capitalism turned on its head. Anything he actually managed to glean relatively accurately from the real world was interpreted completely backwards because of this, and applied to countries who the basis of his arguments were irrelevant because he was writing and observing the conditions of a different system entirely. So his writings were not just upside down, but applied to the wrong system. Then there's also the fact that what happens in the movie is Emmett seeing his place in a metaphysical reality. That means everything he knows about the dictatorial structure running his life is a fragile lie, actually. He realizes his true potential as a creative person to compete with the ideas of Lord Business, and maybe even build his own bunk couch if he wants. The conclusion is different, but the idea is coming from the same emotion. We want freedom, we want prosperity. We don't want to be controlled and oppressed. This doesn't mean to destroy capitalism, on the contrary. It means capitalism is our best solution to authoritarianism and the betterment of the well-being of all. As Vitruvius says, you must embrace what's special about you. He says that to Emmett. And this is the thing that repeats in his mind when he's having this revelation. Well, Marx didn't believe that we are all differently abled by will or any mental or individualistic factor alone. He was materialist. He believed that cripples or weak people were in need, and those who were able, physically capable, would provide for them. He didn't mean from each according to his particular specialized skill set, which is especially great even compared to others who have the same or greater physiological abilities. He also didn't mean that now that you're enlightened with your class consciousness, suddenly your ideas are able to be unique to you now, and you can have free will of thought, unbridled by best interests. Rather, he thought now it's your enlightened class interest to bring about the social change. So me arguing against this shouldn't be possible, according to him.
Emmett becomes enlightened, at least a little bit. The vision he has shows his eyes opening fully for the first time. Emmett, however briefly, experiences reality for what it actually is. That, of course, being the world around us humans. This is not just metaphysically materialistic, it's dialectically materialistic.
Marx believed through dialectical materialism, we could achieve communism after socialism, post-capitalism. He thought that that was part of the structure, is that it would go through feudalism, go through capitalism, go through socialism, and eventually achieve communism. All we needed was the next circumstances in the world which would manifest the right tools to bring the right societal change, which will inevitably bring communism. Being unable to argue against the people who disagreed with him, he just identified their class and said they can't see truth because they're bourgeois. Though Marx and Engels themselves were also bourgeois, thus starting the trend of Marxian socialists attacking their contemporary critics with projections that they themselves are guilty of and could be criticized of. Marx was Hegelian. Hegel was an alchemist. He believed that you could use alchemical techniques to bring about new societies through the understanding of the universe holistically. And the way to accomplish this knowledge was this Hegelian adulteration of the Greek dialectic. So in ancient Greece, the concept of the dialectic is to use competing ideas to come to a more accurate conclusion of the nature of things. The beginning of the scientific method of peer review, basically. Hegel, being a Hermeticist, believed that there was a divine true way of knowing the universe and that we could all come to know it. And he believed that he found it because he was also Gnostic. Hegel claimed to have the eyes of God, literally. Quotes. He claimed he knew, finally, the way to bring about the end of history through the accumulation of God's knowledge. For God to finally come to know himself as the universe itself. The dialectic was reappropriated for Hegel's process of achieving holistic conclusions. When you mix this alchemical hermetic Gnosticism with a deep resentful angst over society for not providing you with the positions of intelligentsia that you feel that you deserve for having put in all the work of the education system, you get a Marxian philosophy. And Marx thought this dialectic should apply to the material world rather than the ideas of man, since those ideas are, according to Marx, exclusively according to their material body and their interests assigned to them by their social societal class. So Emmett's discovery is supposed to be dialectically materialistic because the piece of resistance turned out to be the antithesis of the Kragle, not only being able to close the glue, but affecting Lord Business's personal ethics thanks to movie magic. Well, Marx doesn't describe precisely how the antithetical tools to bring about change in the material world actually come into being. However, he did say that he thought Hegel was wrong, that ideas took precedent over the material world, so it couldn't be by a man, at least not directly, so the conclusion that any reasonable reader comes to is that Marx expected the tools to simply manifest themselves, just as fully cooked chickens were to float into the open mouths of the blissful communists, magically, from the conditions of the time. And his theory actually kinda does apply here, because it's a world that's a reductionist analogy to the real world, and through metaphysical magic and contrived coincidences, the main character finds the antithesis to the Kragle. But the biggest problem in it operating under Marx's theory is that this piece of resistance is actually really, literally just a small part of the Kragle, which is crazy glue, a product designed by a man who capitalized on his ideas and provided something that the market was in want of. The same product that's causing the fear of cementing in the movie. The Lid actually doesn't do anything to the plot without the mentality shift of Will Ferrell toward letting his son play with his Lego. And honestly, how long can crazy glue even last without a lid on? It would have dried up anyways, so the lid kind of is irrelevant. I think if the writers actually wanted there to be something truly dialectically materialistic, they would have made it so that, I don't know, maybe as people are being cemented down, some new tool, nail polish remover, maybe, revealed itself to alleviate the oppressed class of its burdens, that manifests itself out of the conditions of the time. And this new material tool would appear out of the circumstances of the metaphysical superstructure, which would be the kid grabbing his mom's nail polish remover to save his favorite Lego pieces or something. So the moral that we should embrace our individual ideas would remain, but applying the dialectical materialist solution to real life doesn't work at all. It all relies on magic. And even with movie magic, it doesn't do that because it's not a Communist Manifesto. So just after writing that rant, I went back to continue reading The Anti-Capitalistic Mentality by Ludwig von Mises, where I started the second chapter, a few paragraphs into which Mises says, "The doctrines of Marx received approval simply because they adopted this popular interpretation of events and clothed it with a pseudo-philosophical veil that made it gratifying both to Hegelian spiritualism and to crude materialism. In the scheme of Marx, the material productive forces are a superhuman entity independent of the will and actions of men. They go their own way, that is prescribed by the inscrutable and inevitable laws of a higher power. They change mysteriously and force mankind to adjust its social organization to these changes. For the material productive forces shun one thing, to be enchained by mankind's social organization. The essential content of history is the struggle of the material productive forces to be freed from the social bonds by which they are fettered." Close quote. So if Marx believes that these material productive forces, these tools, are driven by their own mysterious superhuman power, then that means that it's not by the design of man that these tools come into being. So the lid of the crazy glue, literally being part of the crazy glue, it has nothing to do with Marx's philosophy. It isn't dialectically materialistic because it's part of the same thing. It was made by the guy. It was the same tool initially. It's not like it's a new thing that's being discovered. And it's not like it would do anything that wouldn't happen without it being there in the first place, so it's just wrong. Anyway, Maxmunich then says that
gaining consciousness is a meta-reference to one of the true intentions of the film: make children class conscious.
Make children class conscious. And honestly, because of children having a less potent separation of fantasy and reality, they would have a hard time separating the corporate structure displayed in the Lego movie and their interpretation of corporations in real life. Given that the main drivers of their current interpretations are commonly anti-corporate sentiments, things like how unfairly workers are treated, kids get raised being told the system the world operates under is a corrupt shell of Western capitalist democracy, which everyone just shortens to saying capitalism, never allowing the child a chance to separate the original concept of capitalism, or rather the free market economy, with what comes from authoritarian interventions. The outcome of the governmental control fueled by the public demand by uneducated and empathetic protesters for reparations is that corporations, through economic Socratic irony, only have more oppressive and exploitative business practices, leading to more uneducated people and more oppressed people and more empathetic people who continue to misidentify capitalism as the problem and then it continues to perpetuate itself. Maxmunich says,
in both the real and Lego world, we face the guarantee of total destruction if we do not take action, and the cataclysmic stakes at hand are communicated perfectly by the movie.
This is simply another case of Marxian misinterpretation of his own societal structure for that of a lord-slave exploitation dynamic. He's just wrong about the world in ways that I've already covered, so the only place to agree is that if we become complacent, we don't stay creative, and we don't stay actively competing with each other, we all start agreeing and complying and conforming, then we very likely could become a monopolistic corporatocracy. So in that part, in that sliver, he's correct. But in that sliver of truth is what he's using to drive his ideology forward. Okay, back to the analogy of Lego and real world. Lord Business is the kid's dad. Whenever the kid goes downstairs to play with the Lego, his dad makes sure he's building by the instructions and only gets to pretend to be a construction worker to help dad complete his collection sets. The son wants to build freely and doesn't care about the instructions. In Emmett's world, Lord Business will put you to sleep if you don't follow the instructions. That analogy is directly on the nose in both the authoritarian but also the other father-son analogy, where the father's putting his son to bed because he messed with his one thing wrong and he didn't do it how daddy said so. There's a right and a wrong way. Lego gave us these perfect sets and they're not to be adulterated. Everything within the instructions and nothing outside the instructions. We also see in the streets of Emmett's world banners. And the banners have demands on them, and a rule number listed. The rules are things like, don't play in the street, no chewing gum, don't touch my stuff, Rule 182. To a child whose fun is being dictated as fun within the lines, the son sees his life as being controlled by a totalitarian dictator who demands that any happiness will be found only within his rules alone. In Emmett's world, the master builders are capable of building things that aren't in the instructions. This is an existential threat to Lord Business. If Lord Business were a capitalist and not a dictator, he would allow new ventures to arise outside of his perfect vision, allowing the best idea to contend in the competition to win the favor of the masses. He would allow it because he would know that under a free market economy, even when your competitors outperform you, your standard of living will increase, simply because there are now better or cheaper products or services being put to market, available for you, which allows for more innovation and more charity. However, as a dictator, Lord Business sees it as pertinent that everyone in the world follow his rules and instructions. Everyone within the lines and nobody outside the lines. These are the dad's Legos. The kid's Legos are upstairs with the little sister, which actually reveals that the son's not in a dictatorship of fun. His sister is chaotic. His sister has chaotic childish pieces. And apparently, his father even bought him his own sets. Batman, superheroes, the pirate and spaceship kits all come to mind. So his dad got him these sets to play with his sister, or by himself. But he doesn't want to play with her. He doesn't want to play by himself. He doesn't want to use his own pieces. Well, now the entire analogy is shifted into a conditional analogy attached to a singular character within the narrative that's dependent on his false interpretation of the scenario because of his own actions and choices to not use his own property. And the story still plays off of his incorrect interpretation of his conditions. He has the choice not to go mess with his dad's stuff, but he chooses to go do that. He's bringing himself into a place where someone else owns all the stuff. He's revoking his agreement of the private rights of ownership because he resents his neighbors. To avoid that, he should have tried to cooperate better off the bat, and I mean, the dad could have been nicer, but that's the whole point of the story, so they need these flaws. The evil world Maxmunich criticizes in the movie is the exact goal of communist globalists right now, so it's the society that I think his ideology is working toward, thus continuing the trend of Marxian philosophers failing to realize that they're projecting. He doesn't seem to honestly understand capitalism, or even communism, in the slightest, but he can parrot information that he's built pseudo-functioning patterns of thought off of to viewers in a way that paints a compliant, conforming, and class-struggling proletarian. That's where I'm ending this. Originally, I was gonna record like this, put my screen bottom of the corner, do the whole shtick. But I was recording audio while I was watching the video for the first time, playing and pausing and making comments, until I realized I was an hour and a half into recording, 5 minutes into the video. That was way too long. So I wrote a script. All my script comments only went as far as about 7 minutes into Maxmunich's video. It was a very long script, so I decided to record what I had and see how long it went. And it went for 45 minutes. So I decided to just cut that up and make that into a video, and then perhaps release it as parts if I decide to make more videos, because this is very long. So I don't know if I'm gonna do that. If this gets enough attention, I will make more parts. But otherwise, I think I've made some pretty good points here. So that's where I'm gonna stop. Alright, peace. That's about it, as the moist man says. Alright, if you're communist, fuck you.